All right, welcome back. I guess you are here for round three, and hopefully giving you some material in a way that you can what? You can hand it off. It goes from person to person to person. Just think of the 440 like with the Olympics where they hand the baton off. If I give it to you, I want you to give it to somebody who can give it to somebody else, and we make sure there's no letdown. Whether they heard me or heard you or heard someone else, they get the same basic material. It can always be changed with stories, different people, but the framework, the skeleton, it can be the same. You start training people that way in your church, and what you'll end up with is the same thing I've seen in churches everywhere we've been. You can have a whole group of men and women that have 30, 40, 50 lessons underneath. I call them putting arrows in your quiver. If you were at our church, you'd have people that would say, yeah, so do I have an arrow for how do you share with Mormons? Yeah. How about Jehovah's Witnesses? Yes. How about Muslims? Yes. How about dealing with the evolution creation controversy? Sure. How about inerrancy? Sure. How about spiritual gifting? Sure. How about spiritual warfare? Yep. How about trials? We'll get to that one. Just different lessons. On Wednesday night, we were dealing with the same kind of concept, just a different book in this series. In this one, we deal with forgiveness. This is what we're going to deal with this hour. When you sin against God, what do you do? How do you handle that? What we were dealing with last Wednesday night was forgiveness. I just called it Part B. What do you do when someone sins against you? So in other words, the common denominator is the issue of forgiveness. But sometimes it's me having to think, how do I deal with God? I'm embarrassed. There's another type of forgiveness too, though, when someone sins against you. Not the same verses. So what I'm suggesting is each one of those represents an arrow in the quiver. And I just learned to go, if I need it, I can pull it out. But if I don't need that arrow, it's safe right there. It's not hurting anybody. It's just right there in that little quiver. So let's build where we were. We've looked at, is there a biblical basis for discipleship? The answer is what? Yes. Is it just Karl's thing? Nope. Does it need to be a part of any church, any work you're doing? Yes. Yes, it does. There's got to be people training people strategically to be able to reproduce, spiritually reproduce, so that you aren't doing work alone. So that you're always increasing the foundation, the base of the people who are equipped to take on service with you instead of you killing yourself and dying from exhaustion. Sometimes that can happen simply because we didn't either take the time or didn't know how to train other people. And the tragedy is you can have a wonderful man or woman doing work, but if it dies with them because nobody was ever trained, pretty sad. Pretty sad. So we looked at that. We looked at assurance. Why? Because it's one of the big four that I think come up often. I told you earlier when I take out mission teams, they've got to have the four. They've got to have these. I said with one difference. The lesson we did on a biblical basis for discipleship, I would handle that with the team members during boot camp. But the lesson we would use, they take on the road, is how do you lead somebody to Christ? How do you go through the gospel? So the four I would give them that they had to have was, first, how do you lead somebody to Christ? Two, how do you make sure they know they're a Christian? Three, how do you deal with forgiveness when you fall on your face? And then four, how do you deal with trials when we start annoying each other because we're in vans driving all over the place hour after hour, week after week? Because trials are a part of the mix. Let's deal with the third component, forgiveness. What was the verse that I gave you as a key verse for dealing with assurance? 1 John chapter 5, verses 11, 12, and 13. Last chapter of 1 John. The lesson that I've used for years and years for the question about forgiveness. What's the context? When a Christian sins. How do I deal with that? I go to 1 John chapter 1, verses 8, 9, and 10. So if you put them together, you just remember it's the first chapter of 1 John, verses 8, 9, and 10. And then the assurance is the last chapter of John, which happens to be 5, chapter 5, 11, 12, and 13. So I just remember it's the first chapter, it's the last chapter. The book is the same, 1 John, and verses start at 8 and end at 13 and run consecutive. So if Kent or Keith or one of those guys says, hey, Karl, where's that lesson on assurance? And if I say 1 John 1, and I turn there and they'll say, well, this is talking about forgiveness. I go, oh, chapter 5. Well, how do you know that? Because I just remember these two lessons. One's in the first chapter of 1 John, and one's in the last chapter of 1 John. So if you're wrong, you turn about 3 pages in most Bibles, and now you're at chapter 5. And you'll have someone in the group go, man, Kent, you are a Bible genius. When did you learn to memorize all of that? Well, the truth is, we don't have it all memorized, but you remember, first chapter, last chapter, if you get it right, you're there, and if you get it wrong, just flip a couple of pages either way. So I used to tell people it was like in playing the piano. I was never any good at it. I tried for a while and I quit, to my mother's disappointment, and mine later as an adult. I wished I could have played, but she taught me F-A-C-E, the spaces in the treble clef. Every good boy does fine, the lines. In the bass clef, good boys do fine always. In other words, I found ways to try and remember the lines and the spaces for notes with make a little game out of it. Well, you can do the same thing with the Bible. Again, when I use the word cop, right? C-O-P, on assurance. Context, options, and promise. I'm going to use exactly the same acrostic with the lesson on forgiveness. So I want you to remember, you can use COP, C-O-P, for either lesson. We'll demonstrate that. We'll walk through it so you can give it to somebody else. And then again, I want you to remember, it's the same book, 1 John, and it's either the first chapter or the last chapter. So it gets me cited and I can remember. So what happens? Verse 8, when we're working through 1 John. What's it say? Well, if we say that we have no sin, we deceive ourselves, and the truth is not in us. 9, if we confess our sin, God is faithful and just to forgive us and cleanse us from all unrighteousness. If we say we've never sinned, we make God out to be a liar. So I think to myself, okay, I want to walk through this. I want to tie the assurance and the forgiveness, or the forgiveness and the assurance together, because they'll come up many times in a church context, missions context, youth group context. I've used this with adults. I've used this with junior hires, high schoolers, college kids, married, young married. They can all put their hands around it. It's simple. That's how you want things. Simple, so you can give it to someone else. And then instead of them saying, I'll never be as smart as you don't want that. If they walk away saying, well, I'll never have your personality, or I'll never have your gifting, or I'll never be as smart as you haven't helped them. You've hurt them. You want them to be able to walk away and say, I could do the same thing you did. That's easy. You have actually enabled somebody to become an active soldier on the field instead of telling them they can sit in the stands and be a spectator. We don't need Christian spectators. We need Christian soldiers. We need people involved in the battle. But you've got to equip them. I have found out for most people in the Christian fight, again, I said this when we first started, not typically that they don't want to be involved in the fight. It's more typically that they feel inadequate to get in the fight. They're afraid they'll do something wrong. So do something about it. If I was at work, we'll say I'm a computer whiz, which, trust me, I'm not. But if I had a job working with computers and my boss said, here's something I want you to do, and I said, well, I'm sorry, I don't know how to do that, so I'm not doing that, my boss would probably say either learn how to work with it or you're fired. They're not. I don't take solace in saying I can as if I'm not responsible for it. If I'm a football player, I enjoy the game of football a lot. If the coach gives me a playbook, and at a professional level, I don't know if you've ever seen them, they're about that thick. They're not like high school or college. They're big. And I said, sorry, coach, I don't know the plays. He'll say, well, then you're going to sit on the bench. You're not going to play. You want to be in the game, you got to know the plays. If you're content not knowing the plays, then I hope you're content sitting on a bench, because you're never going to play if you don't know what you're doing. In the Christian context, my salvation is guaranteed by Christ. That's a done deal when it comes into my life. But as far as my active service, I want God to be able to say, I can use you, I can use you, I can use you. I'm not here yet. You're not ready for that, but I'll get you ready. I can use you, I can use you, I can use you. We need some more training for this one. You're not ready yet. I don't want to have him saying, can't use you, can't use you, can't use you. And maybe I can use you on that one. You learned a little bit there. Can't use you, can't use you, can't use you. That person that's ill-prepared is the same person that will say to me, Christian living's boring. I'll say, not in my world. Not in my world. Sometimes I'm ducking stuff that's being thrown at me. I had an article printed up this last week in one of the publishers talking about some of the election stuff going on. Oh my goodness, some of the comments. I'm glad my mom loves me. Because people tend to, even as Christians, what am I saying? Know what you're talking about, jump in the fight. So, we get back to the forgiveness lesson. 1 John chapter 1, verses 8, 9, and 10. How do I remember that? Because assurance is 1 John chapter 5, 11, 12, and 13. They run consecutive. So I'll say to myself, okay, C. Remember the context. Cop. What's the context? What are we dealing with contextually in 1 John chapter 1, verses 8, 9, and 10? Well, the context is when a Christian sins, what are we supposed to do? So you would say, well, the context, the topic is sin, and how do Christians respond? If anyone says, are you sure that's what it's talking about? Remember, the chapters, the verse breakdown, that wasn't in the original autographs when they wrote these things. We put them in to help us to be able to memorize and find things. But in chapter 2, verses 1 and 2, John says, after he's talked about how you deal with sin as a believer, he says, I'm not writing this because I want you to sin, but when you do, I want you to remember we have an advocate. We have a defense lawyer, Christ, the righteous one. He'll stick up for us. So the whole context of this verse is about 5 or 6 in a row is, when a Christian falls on their face, what do? I don't have to plan to fall on my face. I'll fall on my face without planning it. Bad enough when I fall on my face, even worse when I plan to fall on my face. But we'll say I did. I planned something, I fell on my face. Now what goes through my mind is, well, I knew that God would forgive me when I didn't know what I did was wrong. I mean, he knew I just kind of stumbled into this innocently, and so I said, okay, God, will you forgive me? And I'm sure he would, but this time I planned my sin. I mean, I even knew I was going to be stumbling into sin. And I fell on my face. Man, God's going to be so mad at me. Are you sure there's forgiveness if you planned your sin? Maybe I'm the only Christian that's ever in word, thought, or deed knew I was doing something wrong and went ahead and did it anyway. But I would tell you that if you're going to tell me, anybody listening to this, that you have never planned in word, thought, or deed your sin in some situation, you're a liar. You're a liar. There's only one who was sinlessly perfect, that was Christ. But at any rate, we're going to say, whatever I did, I fell on my face. I even planned it, so now I'm wondering, wow, would God still forgive me? Well, 1 John 1 is written to believers. It's a reminder of how to handle the sin issue when you fall on your face. And it's a reminder that your defense lawyer, Christ, chapter 2, 1 and 2, is right there, not if you sin, but when you sin. Then you plan to sin. No, you don't plan it. If you feel bad enough when you fall on your face, you don't have to plan it. But when you do, and you will, word, thought, or deed, ask any married couple how long it was before you thought that the one that you would never raise your voice to or something, you barked, you did something, you go, oh my goodness. Kids will help you find out how selfish you are. Guarantee it. So whatever the issue is, you fall on your face. Well, first I remember I can deny my sin because, see, when I come to options, I've got two. I can deny my sin or I can deal with my sin. So we said, C, cops. Forgiveness is the question. Well, I remember contextually 1 John 1 deals with forgiveness of sin when a Christian falls on their face, okay? Oh, options. Well, how many alternatives are there? I'll say, remember a word that begins with the letter D. 2 words, both D. I can deny my sin, or I can deal with my sin. I'm going to do one or the other. Then I hit P. Is there a promise in this? Yes, I'm promised in verse 9 that when I confess my sin, God is faithful and just to forgive and cleanse me from all of my unrighteousness. So I think, okay, Karl, kind of walk through it slow and clean, help me understand. I'll say, okay, I'm a Christian, something went wrong, something went haywire, whatever the circumstances, I know I've got to deal with it. First, I remember, okay, yes, 1 John 1, 8 through 10 deals with a Christian dealing with sin. So contextually, I know where to go in my Bible. Options. Well, there's two. You can deal with it or deny it. Now, here's how I illustrate that. I think of a cookie. Now, you may not be like me on this one, but I can tell you as a little kid growing up in the Midwest, probably Oreos were probably the cookie of choice, something like that. But at any rate, what I remember we would do is Mom would give us a cookie. We would open the cookie up, my little brother and I, and we would scrape the cream that was in the middle on our finger and eat that, and we would just throw the cookie part away because neither one of us really liked the cookie part. We liked the cream part that was on the inside. And I thought, I can remember options, right? How many? Two, deny or deal, by thinking about that cookie. I'll say verse 8, here's one side of the cookie, says that you can delude yourself into thinking you do not deal with a sin nature like everyone else, because that's what verse 8 is referring to. If you say you have no sin, you're kidding yourself, you're deceiving yourself. You struggle with sin, I don't. I'm sinlessly perfect. When I became a Christian, I became sinlessly perfect. I would ask you, can I talk with your wife for about 5 minutes? Or can I talk with your kids? And we'll dispose of that lie right off the bat. So there are people that would say, well, I don't have any problem with sin. Think of that as one side of the cookie. Verse 10. There are also people that will acknowledge I have a sin nature, I struggle with sin, but I just don't sin. I always do the right thing. If you say you have no sin, you make God out to be a liar. Why? Romans 3:23 says, how many sin and come short of the glory of God? What's the word? All have sinned and come short of the glory of God. That includes me, and guess what? That includes you too. So any Christian that walks around with their nose in the air like they think they're holier than somebody else, say, you haven't been a Christian very long, have you? Because it shouldn't take very long to get past that. But I get back to my cookie and I say, if I want to deny my sin, it's easier to do. Maybe it's more convenient. It's disobedient, but I can do it. Just think of that cookie on the outside. Deny, okay? 8, I don't have a problem with a sin nature. 10, even if I have a sin nature, I don't struggle with sin because I do things right. If I deny my sin, I can deny. I'm a liar. I'm self-deceived. I make God out to be a liar. Or the second, deal. Remember, deny or deal. What if I take that verse sandwiched right in between the two? Not the little cookie stuff on the outside, which we would toss, but the cream. That was a better choice. I want to deal with my sin. So deny, deal. The cookie reminds me, Karl, those are your two options. Context, forgiveness. Options, deny or deal. Now, if I'm going to deal with my sin, I've encouraged people to remember two words that are inside the verse 9. Now, I'm not trying to say that they aren't all important, because of course, Theopneustos, Scripture is God breathed. It's all important. But I have found over the years two words that I want to highlight if I can when I'm going through this lesson. The first word, if we confess our sin, it's the word homologeo. It's the word confess. Etymologically, it just means to agree with God. His way was right, mine was wrong. That's what the word meant, to agree with God. When I confess my sin, I'm agreeing he was right, I was wrong. I should have done it his way. That was what was necessary. Is there a difference between confessing my sin, agreeing with God his way was right, mine was wrong, and just admitting I got caught? I can remember as a youth pastor, so it goes back a lot of years, But I remember we had 2 kids in the youth group, and since this is my 4th church, I won't even tell you which church it was. Since '77, I've been in 4 churches. But at one of those churches, we had 2 kids in the youth group that were having sex with each other in a high school group. And usually that's, when kids are involved in wrong stuff, they're smart enough to keep their mouth shut. But both these kids were kind of naively stupid and arrogant. And they were telling other kids. And I would always tell them, sooner or later, the pastor's going to find out what's going on. Just God makes it that way. And so anyway, I call them into the office, and I sit them down, and I say, we got a problem. And they said, oh, no, we don't. We come to church. We love Jesus. I said, oh, yeah, you come to church, and you love Jesus, but I say, we still got a problem. They're playing real dumb with me. Oh, pastor, what's the problem? I said, well, having sex. You're not married. And I said, Bible's pretty clear. I don't really care what culture says. They may say it doesn't matter, but Bible's pretty clear. Sex is for a context of marriage. And the young lady looks at me and she says, well, it never happens while we're at church. It always happens after school. So you don't have to worry about it. I said, well, thank you for removing that responsibility and concern from me. So as long as you're having sex after school instead of at a church event, then I don't have to worry about that. Yeah, she's totally serious. I said, no, that's not how it works. The guy looks over at me and says, well, Pastor, it doesn't matter because we 1 John 1:9 it every time. We have sex, then we 1 John 1:9. I said, so you have sex knowing what you're doing is wrong, not in a context of marriage, but outside of marriage, whether it's premarital or extramarital. There's no equivocal thinking about that biblically. Culture will say it's equivocal. Jesus never says that. You can figure out whether you want to follow Jesus' marching orders or culture. I live in Seattle. Culture changes like the Seattle weather around here. It can change 3 or 4 times in a day. If you allow culture to determine your actions, you are in to be a yo-yo. You're going to be on a ride that goes up and down and up and down. At any rate, so the 2 kids informed me that one, because it didn't happen at the youth group, I didn't have to worry about it, and the other assured me that they 1 John 1:9 it, so again, I had nothing to worry about. And I said, so are you telling me that you're agreeing with God? That what you're doing is wrong, and you ought not to be involved in that kind of activity? And the girl just, her eyes were flashing, man. She was mad. She looked at me, and I said, see, the truth is, all you're telling me is that you got caught, and you're real angry that I called you in this office, and I'm calling you on it. And I said, there was a day when something like this would have been considered shameful, and you would have never wanted anybody to know what you're doing. I go, kind of a sign of our times where you openly talk about it. Then you're naive enough to think I'm not going to find out about it, or if I know, I won't do anything about it. I go, we got an issue, we're going to deal with it. Well, I told you, we confess our sin. I said, no, you acknowledged you got caught. There's a difference between I did it and I got caught, and all I'm thinking is, how do I do it again and make sure you don't catch me? How do I just be a little bit more sneaky? That's very different from homologeo, from agreeing with God. What I did was wrong, and God, I want to do it your way. They're 2 different issues. So the first word I want people to remember when we're going through 2 options. Remember? We've got denying or dealing. And if I'm denying, I've got 2 options. I can reject the fact that I have a sin nature, verse 8, or I can reject the fact that I actually engage in sin, verse 10. If I say, no, I'd rather deal with the sin issue, the good stuff right in between, I've got 2 words I want to remember. So I've got 2 and 2. I'm looking for symmetry, right? 2 options in denial, 8 and 10. 2 words to remember if you say I'll make the better choice. The first one is, I want to confess my sin. I want to agree with God. I don't promise him it'll never happen again. I can't make that promise. But I can tell him from the heart, God, I agree that what I did was wrong, and I'm asking you to forgive me. I want to do it your way. That's my intent. Second word is all. When we confess our sin, he's faithful and just to forgive us from all of our unrighteousness. Well, you don't know what I've been involved in. There is no forgiveness for me. Well, really? I go, what's the word all mean? Well, I mean, I knew he would forgive me the first time because I didn't even know what I was doing was wrong, and I was a new Christian. But I actually planned my sin. There's an honest person. I actually planned it. I mean, I even put it into motion, and I still did it. And so I figured he'd forgive me the first time around, but why would he forgive me the second time around? So what does 1 John 1:9 say? If we confess our sin, he is faithful and just to forgive us all of our, faithful to forgive us and cleanse us from all of our unrighteousness. Sorry, I'm telling them to rehearse this stuff, guys. All means all. All means all. Well, I was involved in homosexuality. All means all. I was involved in extramarital sex. All means all. I was involved in premarital sex. All means all. I embezzled money at my business. All means all. I'm a slanderer. All means all. I lied about someone and got them in trouble. All means all. I robbed a bank. All means all. I lied to my parents. All means all. I cheated on a test. All means all. When we confess, he, God, is faithful and just to forgive our sins and cleanse us from all of our unrighteousness. Why do I say I want you to remember both those words? Because there is a difference between confessing sin and just acknowledging I got caught. There's no intent at all in acknowledging I got caught other than don't want to get caught again. I got my little brother a spanking when I was a little kid because I was telling the truth, but I wasn't telling the truth. I was deceiving. I'll tell you what I did. I still think it's funny to this day. I'm 63, he's 62. I still get a chuckle out of it all these years later. My mom had made cookies. We were in Scottsbluff, Nebraska, where I was born. My mom only made cinnamon rolls or cookies when she was giving them away, which as a kid we thought it was a bummer. So for you moms that make stuff and then give it all away, don't forget your kids. Because you smell the house, smells so good, and then you go, okay, neighbors are going to get good stuff, or not. The cookies we got were burned ones. If she had some she was embarrassed to give away, the kids got those. But as long as they were good, they went to the neighbors, right? So she made cookies, and she said, boys, and it was the two younger ones, there were four of us, it was me and my younger brother. She said, you know, these are for neighbors, don't eat all the cookies. I said, okay. My mom went out of the room, I opened up those cookies, and I started eating them. And I don't remember how many I ate, but we'll say there was 25 of them there, and so I ate 22 out of the 25. I wrapped it back up. My mom came in and said, who ate all the cookies? And I looked at my mom as innocent as I could, and I said, Mom, I didn't eat all the cookies. So she went over to my younger brother, picked him up, and spanked him. And she said, since your brother didn't eat all the cookies, and you were the only one else in the room, and he was trying to protest, but he was younger than me, you know, by about 14 months. And Mom left, and I just started laughing. And I just basically said, you got to be quick on your feet, son. And he said, you lied. I said, did I lie? I said, Mom said, who ate all the cookies? I didn't eat all the cookies. I left 2 or 3 of them. So when I told her I didn't eat all the cookies, I told the truth. So don't call me a liar. And he says, well, you know what she meant. And I just basically said, if you're not quick enough to keep up with that stuff, then that's on you. So he took the spanking, and I got away with it. As adults, I told Mom one time or other, and she just goes, boys, I trusted you guys, especially me. And I trusted, so, you know, I let my mom down. But what am I suggesting? I'm saying whether it's a sin of just diabolical whatever, or even if it's something just that simple where you know what's being said, but you deliberately deceive, that's sin. That's wrong. So for someone to say, I don't sin, you're a liar. Somewhere, word, thought, or deed. But what do? First, I know 1 John 1, 8 through 10 deals with what do Christians do if they fall on their face. Options, 2, deny or deal. How do I represent that? Cookie. If I want to deny, think of verse 8, and the outside's of the cookie. Say you don't have a sin nature. You're deluding yourself, is what the text says. Or say, okay, I do, but I don't struggle with sin. Then you're calling God a liar who says all sin. Okay, so denial probably not a real good option. How about dealing with it? If I'm going to deal with it, remember the 2 words. Make sure with a person you go over. Confession. What's it mean to confess? I agree with God. My desire is to not do that again. It's not just to acknowledge I got caught and trying to figure out how do I keep from getting caught. And then the word all. Why? Because anything that I confess, God promises to what? What's the text say? Forgive and cleanse. It's gone. Well, I confessed my sin, but I still felt guilty, and I wish those bricks would get off my back. God's probably saying, what bricks? Well, the bricks of, did you confess it as sin? Yes. Did you mean it? Yes. Verse 9, God says, when you confess your sin, God's faithful and just to what? Forgive and cleanse. If you forgive and cleanse, friend, it's gone. It's gone. Well, I would just feel better if I felt better. So if you confess your sin, God is faithful and just to forgive and cleanse if you feel better. But if you don't feel better because you feel stupid about what you did or foolish, then he didn't really forgive you. That's not what the text says. When you confess, he cleanses. That's the promise. Remember, we got context, C, cop, C-O-P, issue of sin. Options, there's two, deny or deal. The promise, when you confess your sin, God is faithful and just to forgive and cleanse. Well, how do I know he'd really forgive me? Guess where we go back to? Just like in your lesson on assurance. What's a verse I use to establish when God makes a promise, he keeps it? I like to use John 14:6. Jesus said to them, I am the way, the truth, the life. No man comes to the Father but by me. When he claims to be the truth, how many times does he lie and still be the truth? Well, he can't lie or he wouldn't be the truth. He is truth incarnated. That's what Christ was saying. That's why he was more than a carpenter. McDowell got that right. He was more than he was God in the flesh. That's what Colossians 2:8 says. That's what John 1:14 says. Christ was God in the flesh. He was sinlessly perfect. He makes a promise, you can go to the bank on it. So he promises, Karl, when you confess your sin, I will be faithful and just to forgive and cleanse. It's gone. Did you confess that sin? Yes, I did. Then where is it? It's gone. Well, how come I still feel guilty, so I'll confess it again? Why would you confess it again? It's gone. Have you confessed that sin before? Little Bert Farkelson, we'll pretend like he's sitting there. Bert says, Karl, I've confessed that sin 1,000 times. I say, why 999 times more than you need to? Well, I want God to know I'm sincere. He already knows that. He knows everything. Well, I didn't cry. Well, what's that mean? Well, someone told me that when you confess your sin, there's real repentance and you'll cry. Well, what if you're not a crier? I don't cry very much. But when I make a commitment, I try to keep it. See, again, we put hoops on it. It doesn't say when you confess your sin and make a promise you won't keep. When you confess your sin and cry. When you confess your sin and someone else says, my, that was real repentance. I know that was genuine. God knows my heart. He knows what's real and what isn't. I confessed my sin. I can go to the bank on the one who is truth incarnated, John 14:6, to forgive me and cleanse me from all of my unrighteousness. Does that include whatever it was that I just confessed? Say yes, because it includes that. So I don't have to lay in guilt. No. I tell people, think of maturity and think of forgiveness like this. If you put an imaginary line across my office and call it a tightrope, you walk a tightrope. You ever been to the circus and people walk on the tightropes? If somebody said, as a Christian, I want to be perfect in my walk with God, it's like I'm going to walk back and forth and back and forth and back and forth without ever slipping or wobbling or anything like that. Now I'm maturing. See, I believe you set yourself up for a fall. There was only one who was sinlessly perfect. There's only one who never wobbled on the wire. What's maturity? I'm growing mature. I'm growing in Christian maturity when I put more space between the wobbles. I wobbled here, and as a new Christian, I wobbled here and here and here. As I start maturing, I wobbled here, and then I didn't wobble again until clear over here. As I'm putting more space between the wobbles, I'm growing. And the second component of that is when I get up faster. So you'll run into people, especially as new Christians, they do something wrong, and they play the role of the victim. They lay on their back. They moan and groan about it. They don't do anything about it. They make themselves feel miserable. They make everybody else around them feel miserable until they finally say, I probably need to go to 1 John 1:9 and confess this, and God is faithful to forgive me and cleanse me. Go, yeah, that's probably what we need to do. Okay, I did it, but in the 6 months it took me to get there, how many people's faith did I blow up? Well, man, I thought you were a Christian. Oh, nothing ever works out right for me. This is just too hard for me. I can't do this, whatever. Now you not only hurt yourself, you discourage people around you. Maturity is not when you're walking sinlessly perfect. Maturity is when you're putting more space between wobbles and when you start getting up faster. So if you fall on your face, God will be faithful and just in forgiving you and cleansing you if you do that in 6 seconds or 6 minutes or you wait 6 years. My thought is, why do I want to waste 6 months dealing with sin when it's bad enough I already fell on my face in the first place? It's bad enough that something behind me hurt me. Why should I give it today? It already wiped out yesterday. Why should I give it tomorrow? It already wiped out yesterday and today. If it's bad enough that it already, then deal with it. And deal with it now. When I learn to put more space between wobbles and when I learn to get up faster, that is a growing Christian. And I want to be a growing Christian. Well, what if you don't feel forgiven? Remember John 14:6. I go to the bank on the fact Jesus is the truth and always keeps his word. Who's the one who tells me when I confess so cleansed? That's God Almighty. Titus 1:2. It's impossible for God to what? Lie. And again, Jesus claims to be truth incarnated. So, well, that's kind of arrogant to think because you confess your sin that you're forgiven. That would be arrogance if I think it depends on me or my verbiage or how long it's just confidence if I go to the bank on the fact God keeps his promises always. He promised, you confess, all cleansed. I confess, therefore I know he what? He cleansed. So let's get up, dust yourself off, and get moving. The Holy Spirit does not torment me. The Holy Spirit convicts me of sin so he can comfort me. He can patch me up. He can pack me up, and he can throw me back out in the war again. Say, let's go. I need you in the battlefield. I don't need you in a fetal passive position, whining, playing the role of a victim. I need you to be a soldier in the fight. I just feel so bad. Then confess it and deal with it. I know, but if I moan and groan, it makes people know I'm sincere. God already knew one way or another. If you're sincere, deal with it, get up and go. Why should I allow my desire to have other people know, oh, he was really sincere? Why should I allow that to wipe them out? Wives, I'm going to give you something. I don't usually throw this one in. I'm going to sound like a sexist wanker, but I'm going to give this to you. I find very few men that if they walk up and say, man, I've got to ask you for forgiveness for something I did, what's up? They deal with it, they'll confess it. Guys will usually say, okay, let's go on. I've watched ladies, when you do the same thing, and they'll say, well, you didn't sound very sincere. Your lip didn't tremble. I say it again so it sounds more sincere. Where does the text anywhere say that when you confess your sin, God is faithful and just to forgive as long as you can convince somebody that you said it in a way that your voice quivered so they know you meant it? God knows the heart. Mark 11:25 and 26 says, when someone sins against you and asks for forgiveness, then you forgive them. That's your job before God. It isn't to grind it in and bury it and hold them over it and remind them of it so that you can say, all right, now I got my blackmail clause here. Next time I'll just bring this up again. Shame on you. We're supposed to forgive the way God forgives us. That's what Ephesians 4:31 and 32 says. Does God hold stuff over our head and grind it back in when we ask him for forgiveness? No, he says he forgives and cleanses, means it's gone. So let's get up and get back in the fight. Let's dust off our pants and get back in the fight. I don't want to hold stuff over people's heads. I want people to know that, you know what, I want to forgive the way I like to be forgiven. And biblically, I've even the Matthew 18:21 to 35, that's the parable. I'm supposed to forgive the way God forgives. And again, Ephesians 4:31 and 32, it's just commanding. I'm to forgive others the way Christ forgave me. Unless I want him holding it over my head after I say forgive me, then I need to not do that to other people. And that again, that agrees with Mark 11:25-26. So what am I saying? I'm saying you will fall on your face. We all do. Don't plan it. It happens enough without planning it. But if you fall on your face, where can I go? Oh, 1 John 5. Well, that's close. That's 11, 12, and 13. That's our lesson on assurance. Well, then it's got to be chapter 1. You're right, because if it's not 5, it's 1. And it's got to be what? 8, 9, and 10, because they run from 8 to 13 consecutive. Well, how can I remember it? Just remember your cop acrostic. What's the context of verses 8, 9, and 10? Every one of them dealing with forgiveness. What are the options? I got 2 of them. How do I remember that? 2 D words, deny and deal. What represents denying my sin? A cookie. The outside parts that aren't very good. At least I never liked them. I have no sin problem, or I've never sinned anyway. You're either deceiving yourself or a liar. How about I take second option? Option B, door 2. I'll deal with it. Okay, I want to deal with my sin. I want 2 words to remember there. Got what? Confess, I agree with God. I'm not just admitting I was wrong, I'm agreeing, God, your way was right, mine was wrong. I want to do it your way. When I confess my sin, God is faithful and just to what? Forgive and what? Cleanse. It's gone. What's gone? All. He's faithful and just to forgive and cleanse all. Well, I have these staggered levels of sin in my mind that if someone does this, I'll forgive it, but if they do this, then I'm going to, guess what? When I confess and he cleanses, walk on. Walk on. And remember what I said about maturity. Put more space between the wobbles and get up fast. Immaturity says it happens bing, 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 and you lay on their back and you whine about it forever. Maturity says more space and get up. Why? Because God's faithful and just. Arrogant, arrogant. You say you're forgiven. No, confident, confident. Because the one who forgives me is the one who never breaks his character and never breaks his word. He's the one that promised. I'm on the receiving end of grace. I'm on the receiving end of his promise. He promised. I take him up on his promise. It means I'm cleansed. I am walking on. I'm walking on, ready to be in the fight again, patched up and ready to go. Does that make sense? God bless you.